Black billionaire pulled over by racist cop. The phone call he makes ends the officer's career. The night was cool and serene, with a gentle breeze carrying the faint aroma of pine trees from the nearby woods. David Harrington, a man known for his sharp mind and generous heart, adjusted the cufflinks on his tailored Armani suit as he climbed into his Tesla Model S Plaid. The car was his pride and joy, not just for its sleek design or blistering speed, but for what it symbolized, the culmination of years of relentless hard work and unyielding determination. David had just left a gala held by Feeding America, an organization he had long supported. Tonight's event had been especially significant, raising over $5 million to combat hunger across underserved communities. He smiled, recalling the heartfelt speech given by a young single mother who had benefited from the program. Her gratitude had reminded him why he worked so tirelessly to give others the opportunities he had once only dreamed of. As he eased the Tesla onto the quiet streets of the upscale neighborhood, the car's electric motor purred softly, a stark contrast to the growl of traditional engines. David appreciated this neighborhood's charm, the neatly trimmed hedges, cobblestone driveways, and streetlights that cast a warm glow. It was a far cry from the streets he had grown up on, where broken streetlights left corners shrouded in darkness, and opportunity felt like a distant dream. But even as he drove through the calm night, something gnawed at the edges of his peace. Over the years, David had learned that wealth didn't shield one from prejudice. He had experienced his fair share of judgmental stares and whispered assumptions. Tonight, as he drove home in his high-end Tesla, the unease lingered a faint shadow against his otherwise bright mood. The tranquility of the night shattered as flashing red and blue lights filled his rearview mirror. The sharp blare of a police siren pierced the air, cutting through the hum of the Tesla's motor. David's chest tightened. "Here we go," he muttered under his breath, pulling over to the side of the road. He exhaled deeply, steadying himself as he reached for his wallet in the center console. This wasn't his first time being stopped, but that didn't make it any less unsettling. A tall, broad-shouldered officer stepped out of the patrol car, his heavy boots crunching against the gravel as he approached. David could see the officer's rigid stance in his side mirror. His name tag glinted under the streetlight. Officer T. Briggs. The officer rapped on the window with a firm tap. David lowered it, meeting Briggs's cold, scrutinizing gaze. "License and registration," Briggs barked, his voice devoid of politeness or even basic civility. "Of course, officer," David replied evenly, handing over his documents. His voice was calm, measured a skill he'd mastered over the years. Staying composed was vital in situations like these. Briggs took the papers, his eyes darting between David and the sleek interior of the Tesla. "Nice car," he said, his tone laced with sarcasm. "Yours?" David resisted the urge to sigh. "Yes, officer. I purchased it last month." Briggs raised an eyebrow, skepticism etched into his face. "And what brings you to this neighborhood tonight?" "I was attending a charity event for Feeding America," David explained. "The gala just wrapped up." Briggs let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. "A charity gala? You expect me to believe that?" David's jaw tightened, but he kept his expression neutral. "It's the truth, officer." Briggs leaned against the car, his posture heavy with intimidation. "Do you know how fast you were going?" David's brow furrowed. He'd been monitoring his speed carefully, another habit ingrained by years of cautious driving. "I was under the speed limit, officer." Briggs smirked. "We'll see about that." Without waiting for permission, Briggs began circling the Tesla, shining his flashlight into the tinted windows. He peered into the back seat, then tapped on the trunk. "Pop it." David hesitated. "Officer, is there a reason for this? I provided all my documents and I wasn't speeding." Briggs straightened, his expression hardening. "Are you questioning me? Because I can make this a lot harder for you." The implied threat hung in the air. David nodded reluctantly and pressed a button on the dashboard. The trunk opened silently, revealing an empty space, save for a few neatly folded grocery bags. Briggs rummaged through them with exaggerated thoroughness, his flashlight slicing through the darkness. As Briggs searched, David glanced at his phone, its screen lighting up with a notification from his assistant about tomorrow's board meeting. For a brief moment, he considered calling anyone to document what was happening, but he decided against it. He didn't want to escalate the situation unnecessarily. Briggs slammed the trunk shut and returned to David's window. "You're clear for now," he said, tossing the documents into David's lap. His smirk was back, more condescending than before. "But let me give you some advice. Stick to neighborhoods you actually belong in." David's stomach churned, but he refused to give Briggs the satisfaction of seeing him react. "Thank you, officer. Have a good night." As Briggs strutted back to his patrol car, David sat still, gripping the steering wheel tightly. The officer's words echoed in his mind, each one dripping with prejudice. David had encountered people like Briggs before, people who couldn't see beyond his skin color, who resented his success as if it were a personal affront. Taking a deep breath, David reached for his phone. This time, he wasn't calling to complain. He was calling someone who could ensure this didn't happen again, not to him and not to anyone else. He scrolled through his contacts and tapped a familiar name, Eleanor Carter, the Attorney General. David sat in the silence of his Tesla, the officer's parting words still lingering in the air like an unpleasant aftertaste. His fingers hovered over the screen of his phone as his thoughts raced. It wasn't just about what had happened tonight, it was about what this represented. How many others had faced the same treatment without the resources or connections to defend themselves? The soft hum of the Tesla's climate control filled the cabin, a small comfort against the chill creeping into his bones. David took a deep breath and tapped the contact on his phone. It rang once, then twice, before a familiar voice answered. "David," came the voice of Eleanor Carter, her tone warm but tinged with curiosity. "I wasn't expecting to hear from you tonight. Everything okay?" David's voice was steady, but carried an undercurrent of frustration. "Not exactly, Eleanor. I just had an unpleasant encounter with one of your officers." Eleanor's tone shifted instantly, her voice now sharp and focused. "What happened?" David recounted the encounter in detail, the unwarranted stop, the baseless accusations, and the officer's thinly veiled prejudice. He spoke slowly, ensuring she understood every nuance, every slight. Eleanor didn't interrupt, but David could hear the occasional rustle of papers on her end, a sign she was already taking notes. When he finished, Eleanor let out a long sigh. "I'm sorry you had to go through that, David. Unfortunately, I've been hearing similar complaints about Officer Briggs. He's been on our radar, but nothing concrete enough to act on." David raised an eyebrow, his frustration deepening. Until now, Eleanor's chair creaked as she leaned back, the faint sound of her tapping a pen against her desk coming through the line. "You're right. This is different, T. Briggs crossed a line several, in fact, and it's time we deal with him. Do you have any video of the interaction?" David glanced at the dash cam installed in his Tesla, its small green light blinking steadily. "I've got a dash cam recording. It caught everything." "That's excellent," Eleanor replied, her voice firm with purpose. "Send it to me as soon as possible. I'll personally ensure it's reviewed and escalated. This kind of behavior has no place in law enforcement." David felt a flicker of relief, though his tension hadn't entirely eased. "I appreciate it, Eleanor, but this can't just be about me. How do we make sure this doesn't happen to someone else?" Eleanor paused for a moment, then spoke with conviction. "We're going to start by holding him accountable, but beyond that, I'll need your help. Someone with your influence and resources can make a real difference. Let's work together on a broader initiative, something that tackles systemic issues like this head-on." David nodded, even though she couldn't see him. "Count me in." David ended the call and leaned back in his seat, the tension in his shoulders beginning to loosen. He forwarded the dashcam footage to Eleanor and took a moment to collect himself. But just as he was about to start the car, another set of headlights appeared in his rearview mirror. This time, the vehicle approaching wasn't a patrol car, it was a sleek black SUV with tinted windows. David's heart skipped a beat. He recognized the vehicle immediately. It was one of the official government cars, often used by Eleanor's office. The SUV pulled up beside him, and the passenger window rolled down to reveal Eleanor herself, her expression a mix of concern and determination. "David," she called out, stepping out of the car. She was still dressed in her business suit, her heels clicking against the pavement as she approached. "I couldn't wait to act on this. I wanted to see the footage for myself." David exited the Tesla, meeting her halfway. "I didn't expect you to come in person. This isn't something I can let sit on my desk until morning," she replied, holding out a tablet. "Let's review it together." The two of them sat in the Tesla, the cabin lights casting a soft glow. David connected the dashcam footage to the tablet, and the video played back with crisp clarity. Every detail was there: the officer's aggressive tone, his unwarranted search of the car, and the chilling moment when he muttered a racial slur under his breath, thinking it wouldn't be heard. Eleanor's jaw tightened as she watched. "Unbelievable," she murmured, her voice laced with anger. "This isn't just misconduct, this is blatant discrimination." David nodded. "And it's all on record." Eleanor's mind was already racing with possibilities. "This changes everything. With this footage, we can not only remove him but also set a precedent. This isn't just about firing one bad cop, it's about sending a message." As the video ended, Eleanor turned to David, her expression resolute. "I'm going to make a few calls tonight. Briggs won't be patrolling by morning." David's lips curved into a faint smile. "And what about the system that let him get this far?" Eleanor met his gaze, her determination unwavering. "That's where your voice comes in, David. Let's use this moment to demand real change training, oversight and accountability. Together, we can make this a turning point." David extended his hand, and Eleanor shook it firmly. In that moment, an unspoken agreement passed between them. This wasn't just about justice for David, it was about creating a better future for everyone. The following morning, David woke early, though sleep had been elusive the night before. The events of the previous night played on a loop in his mind: the officer's dismissive tone, the unwarranted search, and the racial slur that had nearly shattered his composure. But now, as sunlight filtered through the large windows of his modern penthouse, David felt a renewed sense of purpose. He walked into his sleek kitchen, the quiet hum of his espresso machine filling the space. As he sipped his coffee, his phone buzzed on the counter. It was a text from Eleanor. "Meet me at the State Highway Patrol HQ at 10 a.m. I've called a meeting." David's brows lifted slightly. Eleanor didn't waste time. By 9:45 a.m., David's Tesla rolled smoothly into the parking lot of the State Highway Patrol headquarters. The building was an imposing structure, its facade of grey stone and glass reflecting the morning sun. David stepped out of his car, his tailored suit immaculate, his posture calm yet commanding. As he approached the entrance, a few onlookers recognized him. A murmured ripple spread through the small crowd of reporters who had gathered, alerted by whispers of a major internal investigation. David ignored their questions and strode inside, where Eleanor was waiting for him. "Good timing," she said, offering him a firm handshake. Her expression was serious, her usual warmth replaced by a resolute determination. "We're about to make this official." David followed her into a conference room where a handful of senior officers and legal advisors were already seated. Among them was the chief of police, a no-nonsense man with a sharp gaze and a reputation for integrity. On a large screen at the front of the room, the dashcam footage was paused on a frame of Officer Briggs leaning arrogantly against David's car. Eleanor wasted no time. She gestured toward the screen as she addressed the room. "Ladies and gentlemen, what you're about to see is not just an isolated incident. It's indicative of a systemic issue we can no longer ignore." She played the footage, and the room fell silent. The audio of Briggs's condescending tone and the sound of his racial slur hung heavily in the air. A few officers exchanged uneasy glances, while others stared at the screen, their expressions unreadable. When the video ended, Eleanor turned to the chief. "This is unacceptable by any standard. Officer Briggs has not only violated protocol, but has also shown a clear pattern of behavior that undermines public trust. The chief leaned forward, his fingers steepled under his chin. We've received complaints about Briggs before, but nothing we could act on definitively. This changes things. David spoke for the first time, his voice calm but firm. This isn't just about one officer. It's about ensuring that no one else has to endure what I did. Accountability is the first step, but real change has to follow. The chief nodded. Agreed. Briggs will be suspended immediately, pending a full investigation. I'll also be reviewing the conduct of every officer under my command. Just as the meeting seemed to reach a conclusion, an officer entered the room, holding a manila folder. He handed it to the chief, whispering something that made the older man's expression darken. "What is it?" Eleanor asked, her tone sharp. The chief opened the folder and scanned its contents, his lips pressing into a thin line. "It's a report on Briggs. It seems there's more here than we thought." He slid the folder across the table toward Eleanor. Inside were records of multiple complaints against Briggs, ranging from excessive force to racial profiling. There were even allegations of tampering with evidence. Eleanor's eyes narrowed as she read, and none of this led to disciplinary action. The chief sighed heavily. The complaints were either dismissed or buried due to lack of evidence. It appears Briggs had friends in the right places until now. David leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. Looks like those friends are going to have to answer some questions too. By the afternoon, the story had broken. News outlets picked up the leaked dashcam footage, and within hours it was trending across platforms. Headlines like "Racist Cop Exposed by Billionaire's Dashcam" dominated the airwaves, and public outrage surged. Briggs's face was plastered across every major network, his career now in ruins. Protesters began gathering outside the State Highway Patrol HQ, demanding broader reforms. For David, it was a bittersweet moment. Justice was beginning to take shape, but the fight was far from over. Later that evening, David and Eleanor sat down with a coalition of community leaders, civil rights advocates, and law enforcement officials. The room buzzed with ideas and debates, all centered on one goal: reform. David spoke passionately about his vision for a more equitable system. "This isn't about vengeance," he said, his voice steady. "It's about accountability and ensuring that no one, regardless of their background, feels unsafe or unheard. We need better training, stricter oversight, and a commitment to transparency." Eleanor nodded in agreement. "And with the momentum we have now, we can make those changes happen. But it'll take all of us working together." The group began drafting a plan for a new initiative, the Community Accountability and Reform Effort, CARE. Funded in part by David's foundation, the initiative would focus on bias training, community policing programs, and an independent review board for complaints against officers. As the meeting adjourned, Eleanor turned to David. "You know this is just the beginning, right?" David smiled faintly. "I wouldn't have it any other way." She rested a hand on his shoulder. "What you did, standing up, speaking out, it matters. People are listening, David, and they'll keep listening." He nodded, the weight of the day settling on him. "Let's just make sure they're hearing the right message." As Eleanor walked away, David stood by the window, looking out at the city lights. For the first time in a long time, he felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years: hope. David sat in his study that evening, the faint hum of the city filtering through the thick glass windows of his penthouse. The day's events had been a whirlwind, and though he felt a sense of accomplishment, the weight of the larger fight still pressed heavily on his mind. His leather-bound journal lay open on the desk, its blank pages reflecting the dim light of a nearby lamp. He picked up his pen, an elegant Mont Blanc he'd received as a gift after one of his many speaking engagements. Writing had always been a way for him to process his thoughts, to turn chaos into clarity. But tonight, the words didn't come easily. Instead, his mind drifted back to the turning point of the day, his confrontation with Officer Briggs. The image of Briggs's sneer as he tossed David's documents into his lap replayed in his mind. That moment, though brief, had become a symbol of everything David had fought to overcome: prejudice, entitlement, and the insidious grip of systemic injustice. But as he replayed it now, he saw something else, a spark of fear in Briggs's eyes, as the truth began to unravel. David set down his pen and leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes. The work wasn't done, not by a long shot. Across town, Briggs sat in his sparsely decorated apartment, the faint glow of his television illuminating the room. The news anchors' voices droned on, their tone shifting between condemnation and disbelief as they replayed the dashcam footage. His face, now infamous, stared back at him from the screen. Officer Briggs, a 12-year veteran of the force, is under investigation for allegations of racial profiling and misconduct, the anchor reported. The footage, provided by billionaire philanthropist David Harrington, has sparked outrage nationwide. Briggs reached for his beer, his hand trembling. He knew his career was over. The phone calls had already started, first from his commanding officer, then from a few former colleagues who now distanced themselves from him. But the worst was the call from his father, a retired police sergeant whose voice had been heavy with disappointment. "You've brought shame to the badge," his father had said, his words sharp as a blade. "And don't think for a second that your name will protect you this time." Briggs tossed the empty beer can across the room, the sound of aluminum clattering against the wall, echoing in the silence. For the first time in his life, he felt powerless. The following morning, David met with Eleanor and a small team of legal advisors at her office. The room was filled with the quiet hum of activity files being sorted, emails being drafted, and phone calls being made. On the center table sat a stack of documents detailing the results of a preliminary investigation into Briggs's career. Eleanor gestured toward the files. "We've uncovered a lot more than we expected," she began. "Briggs has been involved in over a dozen complaints of misconduct, many of which were either dismissed or resolved quietly. There are also allegations that he tampered with evidence in at least 2 cases. David flipped through one of the files, his brow furrowing as he read the details. "And nothing was done?" Eleanor nodded grimly. "He had connections higher-ups who protected him, but with the footage and the public outcry, those connections are crumbling. People are coming forward, not just about Briggs, but about others in the department who've enabled this behavior." David closed the file, his mind racing. "This isn't just about one officer. This is a systemic issue. How far are you willing to go, Eleanor?" She met his gaze, her expression resolute. "As far as it takes." Meanwhile, the community response was growing louder. Protests had spread from the State Highway Patrol HQ to the city center, where hundreds of people gathered, holding signs that read, "Justice for all and end police racism." Among the crowd were civil rights leaders, community organizers, and everyday citizens who had felt the sting of injustice in their own lives. David watched the coverage from Eleanor's office, his heart swelling with a mixture of pride and sadness. He recognized some of the faces in the crowd, people he'd met through his foundation, many of whom had shared their stories of struggle and resilience. "This is what change looks like," Eleanor said, standing beside him. David nodded, "But it's only the beginning." Later that afternoon, a press conference was held outside the State Highway Patrol HQ. The chief of police stood at the podium, flanked by Eleanor and other senior officials. Behind them, the American flag waved gently in the breeze, a stark reminder of the ideals they were supposed to uphold. The chief cleared his throat, his voice steady but firm. "After a thorough review of the evidence, including damning footage provided by Mr. Harrington, we have made the decision to terminate Officer Tyler Briggs effective immediately. Furthermore, we are launching an independent investigation into the handling of past complaints against Officer Briggs and other members of this department." The crowd erupted into applause, but the chief raised a hand to silence them. "Let me be clear. This is not just about one officer. It is about rebuilding trust and ensuring that justice is applied equally to all. This department will cooperate fully with the Attorney General's office to implement necessary reforms." David watched from the sidelines, his expression stoic. He had achieved what he set out to do, but he knew this moment was fragile, a small step in a long and arduous journey. That evening, David returned home to find a letter waiting for him. The envelope was plain, the handwriting unfamiliar. Inside was a single page, the words scrawled hastily. "Mr. Harrington, I owe you an apology. I've worked with Briggs for years, and I knew what he was like. I didn't speak up because I was afraid of retaliation, of losing my job. But seeing you stand up to him has inspired me. I'm ready to tell the truth, no matter the cost. Thank you for your courage. A fellow officer." David folded the letter carefully, his chest tightening. This wasn't just about the past, this was about the future. And if one voice could inspire another, then perhaps there was hope after all. He placed the letter on his desk and sat down, his mind already turning to the work ahead. There were more stories to uncover, more people to protect, and more systems to change. But for now, he allowed himself a moment of quiet triumph. Justice had taken its first step, and David was determined to see it through to the end. The city was buzzing with energy in the days following the press conference. For some, the swift action against Officer Briggs was a sign of progress, a long overdue reckoning. For others, it felt like a mere drop in the ocean of systemic issues that still needed to be addressed. David Harrington, however, remained measured, knowing that moments like these had to be handled carefully. Change, he understood, wasn't just about making noise, it was about building momentum. He stood on the balcony of his penthouse, overlooking the city as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the skyline in hues of gold and crimson. The faint sound of car horns and distant chatter rose from the streets below, where protesters still marched, their voices a steady drumbeat against the backdrop of urban life. David's phone buzzed on the table beside him, pulling him from his thoughts. He picked it up to see a message from Eleanor Carter. "The investigation has unearthed more than we expected. Need to discuss. Can you come by tomorrow morning?" He stared at the screen for a moment before typing back a quick reply. "I'll be there." The next day, David arrived at the Attorney General's office just as the city was waking up. The streets were alive with commuters and the hum of daily life, but inside Eleanor's office, the atmosphere was charged with urgency. Eleanor greeted him with a nod, her expression serious. "You're not going to believe what we've found." She led him into a conference room where a group of legal advisors and investigators were gathered around a large table, cluttered with documents and folders. A projector displayed a flowchart on the wall, connecting names, dates, and incidents in a tangled web that pointed to something far more extensive than a single officer's misconduct. "This," Eleanor said, gesturing to the chart, "is the network that allowed Briggs to operate with impunity for so long." David scanned the chart, his eyes narrowing as he took in the details. "What are we looking at?" Eleanor crossed her arms, her voice steady but tinged with anger. "It's a pattern of protection and cover-ups within the department. Complaints against Briggs and others like him were dismissed or buried. Evidence was mishandled, witnesses were silenced, and in some cases, victims were intimidated into dropping their claims." David's jaw tightened. "And how high does this go?" Eleanor hesitated, then pointed to a name near the top of the chart. "Deputy Chief Alan Mercer. He's been in the department for over 2 decades and has been instrumental in shielding officers like Briggs." The revelation hit David like a punch to the gut. He had suspected there was more to the story, but the depth of the corruption was staggering. "So, what's the plan?" he asked, his voice resolute. Eleanor leaned on the table, her tone firm. "We're building a case, but it's going to take time. Mercer is well connected, and he knows how to cover his tracks. We need more evidence, concrete, irrefutable evidence." David nodded slowly, his mind already working through the possibilities. "What about the officers who've stayed silent? Do you think any of them will come forward?" Eleanor's expression softened. "We've had a few reach out anonymously, but fear is a powerful thing. If we can offer them protection and show them that we're serious about change, we might get the testimony we need." David tapped a finger on the table, a spark of determination lighting his eyes. "Then let's give them a reason to come forward. I'll fund a whistleblower protection program, anonymous tip lines, legal aid, whatever it takes." Eleanor smiled faintly. "That's a generous offer, David. And exactly what we need." As the investigation gained traction, the public response continued to grow. News outlets ran stories about the corruption within the department, bolstered by interviews with community leaders and civil rights advocates. Town halls were organized, where citizens shared their experiences with law enforcement, stories of discrimination, abuse, and the pain of feeling powerless. David attended many of these events, listening intently as people spoke. One evening, a young man named Marcus stood up to share his story. He spoke of being stopped and frisked on his way home from work, of being humiliated in front of his neighbors for no reason other than the color of his skin. "I'm not a billionaire like Mr. Harrington," Marcus said, his voice trembling with emotion. "I don't have powerful friends to call when something like this happens, but I shouldn't need to. None of us should." The room erupted into applause, and David felt a lump form in his throat. He approached Marcus afterward, shaking his hand firmly. "You're right," he said, "and I'm going to do everything I can to make sure you never feel powerless again." Weeks later, Eleanor called David with news that changed everything. "One of Mercer's former aides has agreed to testify," she said. "They've provided records, emails, memos, even audio recordings. It's more than enough to build a case." David felt a wave of relief, tempered by the knowledge that this was just one victory in a much larger battle. "What happens next?" "We're preparing to make an arrest," Eleanor replied. "Mercer won't see it coming." The day of Mercer's arrest was a spectacle. Cameras lined the street as federal agents escorted him out of his suburban home in handcuffs. His face, once a symbol of authority, now bore the unmistakable look of a man whose secrets had caught up to him. As the footage played on televisions across the city, David watched from his living room, his emotions a mix of satisfaction and resolve. This was a moment of accountability, but it wasn't the end. The system that had allowed Mercer and Briggs to thrive needed to be dismantled piece by piece. In the weeks that followed, David and Eleanor worked tirelessly to implement reforms. The Community Accountability and Reform Effort, CARE, launched officially, with funding from David's foundation and support from civic organizations. Training programs were overhauled, an independent review board was established, and policies were put in place to ensure greater transparency. For David, the fight was far from over, but he saw something he hadn't seen before: hope. It was in the eyes of the young activists who joined the movement, in the voices of the officers who vowed to rebuild trust with their communities, and in the quiet strength of people like Marcus, who refused to let fear silence them. As David stood on the steps of City Hall one evening, watching the sun set over a city that was beginning to heal, he felt a deep sense of purpose. Justice wasn't just a destination, it was a journey, and he was determined to see it through. The days following Deputy Chief Mercer's arrest were anything but quiet. While the news of his corruption had sparked widespread outrage, it also exposed deep divisions within the city. Some celebrated the accountability, hailing it as a step toward justice. Others, particularly those within the department and its staunch defenders, claimed it was an overreach, framing Mercer as a scapegoat for larger systemic issues. David Harrington was aware of the delicate balance he needed to maintain. Change, he knew, didn't come without resistance, and resistance could often turn ugly. One overcast morning, David arrived at a community center in the heart of the city. The building, once a crumbling relic of neglect, had been revitalized through a joint effort by his foundation and local leaders. Its colorful murals, painted by neighborhood youth, depicted scenes of unity and progress, a visual reminder of what was possible when people worked together. Inside, the room buzzed with quiet conversation as community members, law enforcement officials, and activists gathered for a town hall. Eleanor Carter stood at the front, her commanding presence silencing the murmurs as she addressed the crowd. "Today, we're here to talk about solutions," she began, her voice steady. "We've taken significant steps, but there's still work to do. Rebuilding trust requires transparency, accountability, and a willingness to listen. David sat in the front row, his notebook open on his lap. He watched as Eleanor skillfully facilitated the discussion, giving each voice a chance to be heard. Some spoke of their anger, their frustration with a system that had failed them time and again. Others shared cautious optimism, hopeful that this time change might be real. When it was David's turn to speak, he rose slowly, his gaze sweeping across the room. "I'm not here to pretend I have all the answers," he began, "but what I do have is a commitment to this community, to justice, and to ensuring that no one feels powerless in the face of injustice. Change is hard. It's uncomfortable, but it's also necessary." The applause that followed was polite but subdued. David knew he'd have to prove his words with actions. Meanwhile, within the department, tension simmered. Not everyone was pleased with the direction things were heading. Whispers of resentment echoed through the hallways, with some officers viewing the recent arrests and reforms as an attack on their profession rather than a call to accountability. One evening, as David prepared to leave his office, he received an unexpected phone call. The voice on the other end was low and hesitant. "Mr. Harrington," the man began, "I'm an officer in the department. I can't say who I am, but you need to know there are people who aren't happy about what you're doing. They think you're trying to destroy the force." David leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. "And what do you think?" he asked calmly. The man hesitated. "I think change is overdue, but it's not going to be easy. Be careful, sir. Not everyone wants to see you succeed." The line went dead before David could respond. The warning stayed with him as the weeks passed. Though no overt threats were made, David noticed subtle signs of pushback. Certain documents took longer to process, meetings with law enforcement officials were rescheduled without explanation, and rumors began to circulate that he was using his wealth to manipulate the system for personal gain. David refused to let it deter him. Instead, he leaned into the work, pouring his energy into the community accountability and reform effort, CARE. The initiative gained traction, with its programs implemented in schools, community centers, and police precincts citywide. Workshops on implicit bias, conflict resolution, and community policing began to shift the narrative, albeit slowly. One evening, as David returned to his penthouse, he found a package waiting for him. Inside was a handwritten letter from a young girl named Maya, along with a drawing of her family. The letter read, "Dear Mr. Harrington, thank you for helping our community. My mom says you're trying to make the police treat people like us better. I hope you do, because my dad is scared to drive to work, and I don't want him to get hurt. Thank you for caring about people like us." David stared at the letter for a long time, the weight of her words settling over him. It wasn't just statistics or headlines, it was families, children, and lives that hung in the balance. He placed the letter on his desk, where it would serve as a constant reminder of why he couldn't stop now. As the investigation into Mercer's network continued, more names began to surface. Officers, administrators, and even city officials were implicated in a web of corruption that spanned years. Eleanor called David late one night to update him on the progress. "We're uncovering things I didn't think possible," she said, her voice tinged with exhaustion. "It's bigger than just Mercer. This could reshape the entire department." David felt a pang of both hope and trepidation. "And the community? How are they responding?" "Mixed," Eleanor admitted. "Some are encouraged, but others think it's just smoke and mirrors. They're waiting for the other shoe to drop." David nodded, though she couldn't see him. "Then we have to make sure it doesn't." The next town hall drew an even larger crowd, spilling out into the streets. Among the attendees were young people like Maya, their parents, and elders who had lived through decades of systemic injustice. David addressed them with a measured tone, acknowledging the challenges ahead, but emphasizing the importance of persistence. "We're not fighting a single battle," he said. "We're working toward a better future, one where trust isn't a luxury but a given, and we won't stop until that future is real." The applause this time was louder, more genuine. For the first time, David felt the ripple of change turning into a wave. Later that night, as David walked through the quiet streets, he passed a mural that had recently been painted near the community center. It depicted a diverse group of people holding hands, with the words "Justice for All" emblazoned across the top. He stopped to admire it, his heart swelling with a mix of pride and resolve. The road ahead would be long and fraught with obstacles, but as he looked at the mural, he knew one thing for certain: the fight was worth it. The city was restless. Though the arrest of Deputy Chief Mercer had set the wheels of justice in motion, the aftermath rippled through the community in unexpected ways. For every person who celebrated the progress, there were others, those entrenched in the old systems, who saw it as a threat. These shadows, as David Harrington came to call them, weren't merely resisting change. They were actively working to undermine it. It began with an envelope slipped under David's office door. Unlike the letters of gratitude he'd received from the community, this one bore no name or return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper, the words typed in bold block letters. "Keep pushing, and you'll regret it." David held the note in his hands, his jaw tightening. He'd faced opposition before, but this felt personal. A cold determination settled over him as he showed the note to Eleanor later that day. "It was bound to happen," she said, though her brow furrowed with concern. "You're rattling cages, David. People don't like that." David nodded, his expression resolute. "Let them be uncomfortable. It means we're doing something right." A week later, during a workshop at the community center, tensions boiled over. Officers participating in the newly implemented bias training program were paired with community members for an exercise designed to foster understanding. The goal was simple: to share personal stories and find common ground. But one officer, visibly irritated, crossed his arms and refused to engage. "I don't see why we're even doing this," he muttered loudly, drawing stares. "I'm not the enemy here." A young man named Marcus, the same one who had spoken at the earlier town hall, stood to respond. "Maybe not," he said calmly, "but if you don't see the problem, how can you be part of the solution?" The officer scoffed, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Easy for you to say. You're not the one risking your life every day." The room fell silent. Marcus's jaw tightened, but he kept his composure. "You're right. I don't know what it's like to be an officer. But you don't know what it's like to walk out of your house every day wondering if you'll make it home because of the color of your skin." The tension was palpable. Before the conversation could escalate further, David stepped in. "This is why we're here," he said, his voice calm but firm, "not to point fingers, but to understand. That's the only way we move forward." Though the incident ended without further conflict, it underscored the challenges ahead. Bridging the gap between law enforcement and the community would require more than workshops. It would demand patience, persistence, and a willingness to face uncomfortable truths. As CARE continued its work, a troubling pattern emerged. Files critical to the investigation into Mercer's network began disappearing. Witnesses who had agreed to testify reported being harassed, and rumors spread that certain officers were leaking information to those under investigation. One afternoon, Eleanor stormed into David's office, a thick folder in hand. "We've got a problem," she said, dropping the folder onto his desk. "Someone inside the department is actively sabotaging the investigation." David flipped through the folder, his eyes narrowing as he read. "Do we know who?" "Not yet," Eleanor admitted, "but I've got a few suspects. I'm assigning a team to look into it. If we find out who's behind this, they're going down." David leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. "What about the witnesses? Are they safe?" "For now," Eleanor said. "But we need to act quickly. If this continues, we risk losing the momentum we've built." Late one evening, as David drove home from a meeting with community leaders, a dark sedan began tailing his Tesla. At first, he thought nothing of it, assuming it was just another car heading in the same direction. But as he turned onto quieter streets, the sedan stayed close, its headlights glaring in his rearview mirror. David's heart began to race. He tapped the button on his steering wheel, activating the Tesla's autopilot mode while he dialed Eleanor. "I think I'm being followed," he said, his voice calm but tense. "Where are you?" she asked, her tone sharp with concern. He gave her his location and she quickly assured him she'd send help. "Don't stop. Keep driving until you see a well-lit area or a police presence." The sedan followed him for several more blocks before abruptly turning off onto a side street. David exhaled slowly, his grip on the wheel tightening. It was a reminder that the fight he was waging wasn't without risk. That night, as David sat in his dimly lit living room, he felt the weight of it all pressing down on him. The threats, the resistance, the fear, they were all reminders of how deeply entrenched the problems were. For a brief moment, he wondered if it was worth it. Could one man really make a difference against a system so vast and deeply rooted? He picked up Maya's letter from his desk, rereading her words. "Thank you for caring about people like us." The doubt melted away, replaced by a quiet resolve. He wasn't just fighting for himself. He was fighting for Maya, for Marcus, for every person who had ever felt powerless or unseen. The next day, Eleanor called with news. "We've identified the mole," she said. "It's Sergeant Daniel Price, one of Mercer's closest allies. He's been feeding information to those under investigation and tampering with evidence." David felt a surge of relief. "What's the next step?" "We're taking him into custody," Eleanor said. "But we'll need to keep this quiet until it's done. If word gets out, it could jeopardize the entire operation." That evening, Sergeant Price was arrested in a carefully coordinated operation. His arrest sent shockwaves through the department, further exposing the extent of the corruption. But it also emboldened those who had remained silent, leading more officers to come forward with information. With Price in custody and more evidence pouring in, the investigation gained new momentum. Policies were being rewritten, officers were undergoing rigorous training, and community members were being given a seat at the table in discussions about reform. One afternoon, David visited the mural near the community center. To his surprise, someone had added a new detail, a small figure standing at the center of the group, holding a sign that read, "Hope lives here." David smiled, his heart swelling with a mix of pride and determination. The road ahead would still be long and fraught with challenges, but for the first time he felt that the city was truly beginning to change. The months following Sergeant Price's arrest marked a turning point for the city. What began as a single moment of injustice had snowballed into a transformative movement. Yet, as the dust began to settle, David Harrington knew the work was far from over. Change, he had learned, was not a singular event. It was a process, and one that demanded vigilance. The culmination of the community accountability and reform effort, CARE, was marked by a public event at the newly renovated community center. The city's mayor, Eleanor Carter, law enforcement officials, activists, and hundreds of community members gathered to celebrate the program's successes and outline the next steps. David stood at the podium, the sunlight casting a warm glow over the crowd. He wore a simple suit, his usual air of sophistication balanced by a palpable humility. "When this journey began, I wasn't sure how far we could go," he said, his voice steady. "But standing here today, I see not just progress, but possibility. This city has shown that when we come together, when we listen, learn, and act, change is not only possible, but inevitable." The crowd erupted into applause, their cheers echoing off the buildings around them. Among them, David spotted Marcus and Maya, their faces shining with hope. One of the event's highlights was a speech by Officer Jessica Alvarez, a young recruit who had been part of the department's new training initiatives. Her words carried the weight of someone eager to rebuild trust. "I joined this profession to serve and protect," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "But I've learned that serving also means listening. Protecting means standing up, even when it's hard. And rebuilding trust means owning our mistakes and doing better." Her speech was met with a standing ovation, signaling a small but significant shift in the relationship between the community and law enforcement. That evening, David sat with Eleanor in her office, reflecting on the journey. The stack of files and documents that had once symbolized the weight of corruption now represented the strides they'd made. Together, they had dismantled a network of systemic injustice and replaced it with the foundation for a fairer system. "There were moments I didn't think we'd get here," Eleanor admitted, sipping her coffee. "But we did." David nodded, his expression contemplative. "We did. But there's still so much more to do." Eleanor smiled faintly. "That's the beauty of it, isn't it? Change is never finished. It's a living thing." The next morning, David received a letter at his office. The handwriting was neat and precise, unfamiliar yet strangely comforting. Inside was a short note. "Dear Mr. Harrington, I watched the event last night, and I couldn't help but feel a sense of pride, not just in what you've done, but in what this city has become. I used to think that one person couldn't make a difference. You've proven me wrong. Thank you for fighting, for standing up when others stayed silent. You've reminded us all that change starts with courage. Sincerely, a former skeptic." David smiled, folding the letter carefully. It was a reminder that even those who had once doubted could be part of the journey. Months turned into years, and the city continued to evolve. CARE expanded into neighboring cities, becoming a model for police reform and community engagement nationwide. The relationship between law enforcement and the communities they served improved steadily, though not without challenges. Each step forward was hard-won, but progress had taken root. David continued his work, balancing his role as a philanthropist with his growing involvement in advocacy. His foundation grew, funding initiatives in education, healthcare, and economic development. But his greatest legacy, he felt, was the hope he had helped restore. One evening, as he walked through the city streets, David passed the mural near the community center. It had grown over the years, with new faces and messages added by local artists. At its center was the same phrase that had been added months before: "Hope lives here." David paused, taking in the mural's vibrant colors and the life it represented. He felt a quiet satisfaction, not because the work was done, but because it had begun. The fight for justice, for equality, for a better world, it was a fight worth continuing. As the city lights twinkled in the distance, David Harrington walked on, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. For he knew now, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that change wasn't just possible, it was inevitable,